I'm sending a subtext out to my universe people. There are some doctors among them. I have a question. The Pope has double pneumonia, and that's according to the Vatican press office. Say a prayer for his recovery and that he not suffer and not be in a great deal of pain. But I'd like to know, he only has one lung. How in the world do you have double pneumonia if you have one lung? So a doctor can explain that. You know, when he was elected Pope by the last conclave after Benedict retired, it was a big deal. He said, I'm not going to be Pope for long. Paraphrasing there, I've got one lung. Everyone knows that. So it's not like a shock, but I'm reading the bulletin from the Vatican tonight, and I just have no idea how you have double pneumonia with one lung. I want to bring up to speed on important talks in Saudi Arabia. The headline in the Financial Times is U.S. and Russia agree to lay the groundwork for ending the Ukraine war. Now, we don't know what goes on inside the closed rooms. All we have are the quotes that emerge from those who are involved. And our team, General Kellogg has some sort of role, but he wasn't in the room today. In the room today were, as far as I can tell from the picture, Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, Mr. Witkoff, Special Envoy, Sergei Lavrov, who appears to be 120 and apparently is pickled. I mean, I remember very well then Ambassador Haley saying on this show he's a drunk. So maybe he's pickled. And then somebody else I've never seen before, and a couple of sheikhs. So it's a pretty interesting room. At the conclusion of it, Waltz and Rubio have a press conference. Here is Secretary Rubio, cut number 11.
The Ukrainians and the Europeans have suggested they feel very sidelined about how the process has played out so far. How do you intend to address their concerns, and will they be incorporated in future meetings in a multilateral way?
Well, the comment I would have on that is that for 3.5 years while this conflict has raged, or 3 years while it's raged, no one else has been able to bring something together like what we saw today, because Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that can. So no one is being sidelined here. But President Trump is in a position that he campaigned on to initiate a process that could bring about an end to this conflict. And from that could emerge some very positive things for the United States, for Europe, for Ukraine, for the world. But first it begins by the end of this conflict. And so the only thing President Trump's trying to do is bring about peace. It's what he campaigned on. It's something the world should be thanking President Trump for doing. He's been able to achieve what for 2.5, 3 years no one else has been able to achieve, which is to begin this process, a serious process. Obviously, a lot of work remains before we have a result, but President Trump's the only one that can do it.
Ambassador Waltz added this, cut number 8.
Look, it's common sense. If you're going to bring both sides together, you have to talk to both sides. And we'll continue to remind everyone, literally within minutes of President Trump hanging up with President Putin, he called and spoke with President Zelensky. So shuttle diplomacy has happened throughout history. It's happened all over the world. We are absolutely talking to both sides. The Secretary of State just met with President Zelensky days ago, along with the Vice President, 7 cabinet members in Europe at the same time, really showing the importance of engaging our allies. President Trump spoke with President Macron just yesterday. Prime Minister Starmer is coming to Washington next week. So I think the facts will continue to push back on this notion that our allies haven't been consulted. They are being consulted literally almost on a daily basis, and will continue to do so.
Number 10 is where National Security Advisor Waltz makes sure that everyone understands what they're talking about. Cut number 10.
What does an enduring and successful end look like? Did you present any proposals to the Russians today?
Well, there are some underlying principles. This needs to be a permanent end to the war, and not a temporary end as we've seen in the past. We know just the practical reality is that there is going to be some discussion of territory, and there's going to be discussion of security guarantees. Those are just fundamental basics that will undergird and underlie any type of discussion. But I think the most important part is the president has stated his desire, his determination to end this war, to end the killing that is going on, the death and destruction that is happening as this war goes on and on, month after month after month, in the killing fields of eastern and southern Ukraine is unacceptable. It is not in the interest of either country. It's not in the interest of the world, and certainly not in the interest of the United States and Europe. So all of those things will drive the negotiations going forward. And as you can see, President Trump is determined to move very quickly. We just had a head of state phone call, the first in years, and here we are less than a week later at the highest level of the U.S. and Russian government, and we expect to continue to drive that pace to not only end the war, but then to unlock what could be very productive and stabilizing relationships going forward.
Cut number 12, Secretary Rubio.
Well, I would start by saying we've agreed on 4 principles that I think are important. The first is that we're going to appoint our teams respectively that have worked very quickly to reestablish the functionality of our respective missions in Washington and in Moscow. For us to be able to continue to move down this road, we need to have diplomatic facilities that are operating and functioning normally. The second point is that we're going to appoint a high-level team from our end to help negotiate and work through the end of the conflict in Ukraine in a way that's enduring and acceptable to all the parties engaged.
That is a good start. One more cut from National Security Advisor Walls, cut number 9.
What the president did not find acceptable was an endless war in Europe that was literally has turned into a meat grinder of people on both sides. So if you just think about, just in a few months, President Trump has shifted the entire global conversation from not if the war is going to end, but just how it's going to end. And only President Trump can do that. And in the Oval Office less than a week ago, both President Putin and President Zelensky both said to him, only you, President Trump, could drive this war to a conclusion.
Now, I want to check on how markets are reacting to this. The market report usually is in next hour. It's brought to you by AmericanFederal.com. Markets are still open at this hour, so it's not the final word. They're all down a little bit. AmericanFederal.com, by the way, 1-800-221-7694. Gold is up a lot, almost 2%, $2,955 an ounce. $2,955 an ounce suggests that markets are not, they really don't understand what's going on. Crude oil is up to $71.80. So whatever the markets make of high-end talks between Russia and the United States in Riyadh, they don't imagine a healthy global oil market coming out of it, at least not immediately. And the price of gold is where people go when they don't know what's going on. If you're going to buy gold today, you do it from our friend Nick Rovich and his team at American Federal, 1-800-221-7694, 1-800-221-7694. And that is not a bad play because this is an unusual thing. The headline in the Wall Street Journal is U.S. and Russia forge new path on Ukraine after first high-level talks in years. And meet Putin's U.S. educated dealmaker in talks with the administration. His name is Kirill Dmitriev. He has long cultivated a quiet role as the Kremlin emissary to the Trump team. He's known for his absolute loyalty to President Vladimir Putin, and I'm glad it's not Lavrov, because I do have questions. Lavrov's window dressing. I do have questions about Lavrov in any situation. But I don't have questions about gold. I'm glad I bought it in January. I buy it every year in January. If you're going to buy it or sell it today, do it with our friends at AmericanFederal.com. Market's not sold on this being a good idea. Also want to remind you that even as Dennis is recovering, Pragertopia continues to roll forward, for example, with this.
Dave Rubin is the host of the extremely popular Rubin Report.
I'm going to get Dennis Prager to have a quarter of a glass of white wine this evening.
You will, actually.
I know. You
How
don't
did you
drink.
hear about this? On the boat, I had white wine.
You had white wine.
I had more wine in the last 2 weeks than in the last 20 years.
You can hear the entire episode of this edition of Pragertopia if you go to Pragertopia.com. That's Pragertopia.com. Also, time for me to remind you, coming up today, we've got Noah Rothman after the break. We have David Drucker, Brett Baer, Andy McCarthy's coming along. Byron York will be joining me. Lilacs is along because it's a Tuesday. A lot going on. I'll keep you up to date on everything that breaks around the world, from the Vatican to Riyadh to in our own backyard. A horrific crash. I can't believe no one died in the Toronto crash yesterday. That's 3. Tragedies come in 3, so hopefully that's the third and last one of those. Noah Rothman is senior political writer for National Review. He joins me now. Noah, good Tuesday to you. I am curious. I listened to the editors yesterday and enjoyed greatly an edition that featured Rich Lowry, Michael Brendan Doherty, and Charles C.W. Cook and Philip Klein, and they had a good time reviewing Vice President Vance's speech to NATO. And in fact, Charlie had the line of the year, they should just make cars and shut up, speaking to the Germans. What did you make of Vice President Vance's speech?
Well, listen, I have no problem with the West throwing its weight around, in particular when it comes to the American efforts to induce a more liberal social compact among its allies. I think that's one of our fundamental objectives as a country. It's a soft power objective, because it does translate into genuine physical, tangible benefits to U.S. interests, advancing U.S. interests. I think the level of antagonism that Vance engaged in was designed to be provocative, and it has had the intended effect. It has provoked many of our allies in ways that I think are probably less advantageous, because they don't necessarily induce cooperation. They more likely induce backpedaling and defensiveness, and everybody getting in their foxholes and pointing fingers at each other. Nevertheless, I don't have any objection to the content of a lot of Vance's speech. What I think is incongruous is the degree to which this administration feels very comfortable hectoring our allies and has a little less enthusiasm when it comes to being aggressive and demanding and provocative with many of our adversaries, foremost among them being Moscow. You know, the administration can say Canada should be the 51st state, and Germany has a terrible history with liberals promoting liberal values, and I agree with all of that, with the exception of the idea that Canada should be a state. But it should be more pliant when it comes to American trade regimes, for example, and pushing our weight around to achieve that matters. But I would like to see consistency, which would soften the blow for Europe, which is reeling now in clutching its pearls in self-defense. That would soften the blow quite a bit if the administration were as focused in securing our interests where they are genuinely threatened than in places where the stakes are relatively low, like
I think,
an intramural
I
debate
put
over
Canada
liberalism in
off on
Europe.
one side. The big issue for me with Canada is that they're not paying their tab on NATO. They're not even keeping up their NORAD obligations. They're not doing the necessary flight because Justin Trudeau has cut their defense to the bone. I wanted to ask you because I don't know. I know that the Prime Minister of Italy was supposed to be a fascist, and she's not. I don't know anything about the Alliance for Deutschland, AfD. I don't follow German politics other than I guess I would be a Christian Democrat if I was a German, but I'm not, so I don't need to know. What is that the AfD does or says that causes alarm bells? And I mean specifically, not that they're 30 years ago were on the right. It's been 80 years since the regime fell. What does AfD represent, and why does it make them freeze in terror?
Yeah, Hugh, this is a bad pundit answer, but the answer is I don't know.
Ah,
I don't
that's
know
a good
enough.
pundit answer. That's the
I don't
best
know enough
pundit
about
answer.
German politics. You know why? Because I'm American. And I don't care about the social compact that pertains in a lot of these societies. What I care about is if they're meeting their obligations relative to our desire to maintain the U.S.-led geosecurity regime that we all benefit from and take for granted. That's what I care about. Whether or not Germany is arresting people for engaging in lewd speech online or whatever the social compact is there, I find horribly distasteful. I think it's an abdication of their responsibility, and it certainly offends my sensibilities as a good civic-minded American. But it's not my control over what the German social compact is. And if I wanted to wield my influence there, I would be doing so by hectoring them rhetorically. I would also not be withdrawing our soft power influencers, the powers of influence that we have in commercial and cultural, as well as hard power political tools, to incent as well as induce more countries to adopt a far more liberal, democratic social policy. That would be my preference. But like I said, I don't know the distinctions. And weighing in, by
NATO's
the way,
hard
weighing in
power.
on German politics without knowing enough about it, which
Good.
perhaps Elon Musk has done, is
I
just as
salute,
reckless.
I salute your reticence because I have the same reticence. I don't know. I know a little bit about this country and a little bit more about that country, but I just generally don't know domestic politics. I do know that NATO is nowhere near 2.5% or 2%. And Keir Starmer, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, said, we're not going to get there for a few years. I really don't know why they think they should be in the room in Riyadh with Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff talking to Lavrov and the financier who's close to the Russian dictator. Do you? I mean,
Well,
I don't understand what they want.
Well, certainly Kyiv should be in that room, should they not? I mean,
No,
we're
I
talking
don't
about
think so yet. I think we're doing shuttle diplomacy first. And I'm okay
Yeah,
with
no,
shuttle
I
diplomacy.
think that's a recipe for failure. And I'll tell you why. Ukraine has politics too. Europe has politics too. These countries care about intangibles like respect and prestige as much as we do. Donald Trump predicates a lot of his policy preferences on those intangibles while focusing entirely on getting tangible physical benefits from them. The notion here that we could have a durable peace that would be hammered out between the United States and Russia, leaving Ukraine out of the equation,
I don't think that's it. No, that's not fair. And Rubio said that exactly today. He said we are doing shuttle diplomacy.
So then what's
Maybe
the
you
point of
haven't
the
heard this
exercise?
yet.
Then what's
He
the point of
said
the
after the
exercise?
meeting. He said after the meeting.
We know. I'm sorry.
He
Continue.
said we're going to meet with the Russians, we're going to meet with the Ukrainians, we're going to meet with the Russians, and everyone's going to get in the room in the end. That is what Kissinger did with the Egyptians and the Israelis before 1973 after Yom Kippur. That's how you bring a war to stop.
Yeah, well, Kissinger also, and this is a great piece in the Wall Street Journal editorial board about, or rather, I think James Holman today, about the failure of the negotiations in Paris and that produced in Vietnam a deal to get the United States out, but a humiliation that lasted a generation. And I think that's a really reasonable parallel to be concerned with here. We've already had something of an incident when it comes to these negotiations. Ukraine is horribly offended by its omission from this process. It is no longer going to Riyadh. There will be no representation of Ukraine in Riyadh because it believes that they're negotiating Ukraine's fate without Ukraine. The Europeans believe that as well. We talked briefly about NATO's threshold, the GDP percentage threshold of defense. We can get there by saying, listen, you're on your own, Europe. You've got to deal with Russia on your own. And maybe London and Paris and Berlin are slow to react, but places like Warsaw and the Baltic states and Romania will not be. They will see to their own defense. Indeed, Poland spends more on its defense, I think, than it's even willing to admit.
5%.
And these nations, maintaining the integrity of the Atlantic Alliance, this unwieldy 33-member beast, is the job of the prima inter pares, Washington. And when we have a situation in which the continent faces disparate threats and doesn't meet them with the same approach, you can have a situation in which the nations on the frontier, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, others, see to their own interests, worry about the prospect of a failed state on their borders, take that measures into their own hands, which introduces a lot more variables.
And next week when we talk, we'll find out whether or not Zelensky's been drawn back in. I think he will be. We'll see. Noah Rothman from National Review, thank you. Always a pleasure to talk to him. Follow him on Twitter at Noah C. Rothman. It's now called X. Earlier today, Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, which I no longer own any stock in, so I'd like to talk more about it. I think it is a very, very good stock to own, but I'm out of it because I'm covering it now. Alex Karp was on with Andrew Ross Sorkin on CNBC, and he talked about what ails Germany and Democrats in the United States. Cut number 18.
Look, what I don't like about what's going on is I just view this as, well, let's watch the Democratic Party commit suicide. And like, I've been a Democrat most of my life. I kind of view myself as outside it, but I don't like watching the Democrats just commit suicide. And what I see is most of the country doesn't really, at this point, given the fraud, waste, and abuse we know is there, 90% of the country is like, get rid of that fraud, waste, and abuse. And I just view this as yet another example of the progressive left boxing themselves into a suicide dance. Now, what the progressive left should be doing is saying, okay, Elon, you're clearly the most qualified person in the world to do something like this. We want to dialogue with you about how you're doing and what are you doing. I don't believe that's actually what happened. And again, I like Elon. I know I think he's obviously the most important builder in the world. And I just think, if you want to say my former side, I don't believe that they're actually engaging. I think it's like another dance where I'm supposed to say, of course, like whatever. It's like there's this one issue where I might, and then you get boxed into you cannot solve the problem. And then I would say, what is the biggest problem in this society? Biggest problem in this society from my perspective is legitimacy of our institutions. Why aren't they legitimate? They're not legitimate because, okay, do any of you really believe that 99% of your taxpayer dollars are being spent? But last and not least, and probably arguably most...
There. Biggest problem in the society is that the rising generation doesn't believe as much in it as I did when I was their age. I teach them. Remember, I teach them. And they just don't believe. Let me play John Kennedy, senator from Louisiana from yesterday on with Hannity, cut number 16.
I've got a lot of friends who are Democrats, and they haven't asked me for advice, but if I did, I'd tell them, look, you just got to try harder not to suck. I mean, think about it. Over the past 4 years, the Democrats mismanaged Congress, they mismanaged COVID, they mismanaged the economy, they mismanaged inflation, they mismanaged the national debt, they mismanaged Afghanistan. More recently, in their opposition to President Trump and Mr. Musk, the Democrats have chosen to support the bureaucrats and the spending porn over the American taxpayer. Just like they support illegal immigration over the rule of law, just like they support transgender athletes over women's sports, just like they support Hamas terrorists over Israel. All Democrats are not like this, but the party is controlled right now by people who majored in online activism with a minor in puberty blockers. I know these people. They think women, they think men can breastfeed. They're triggered by race. They cry if you use the wrong pronoun. And most fair-minded Americans look at this and they go, these people are about 10 exits past normal.
I like that
and
line.
That's what's killing them.
10 exits past normal. John Kennedy never failed to deliver a Louisiana twist on whatever he's talking about. Very fine lawyer. Do not fall for that bit. Very, very, very good lawyer. 10 exit past normal is good. AndrewandTodd.com is good. Andrew and Todd are my sponsors for people who are looking to buy a house. I asked my students this week, how many of you expect to buy a house? And their expectations are quite low because interest rates are quite high. The reality is you'll be able to. You'll be able to buy it even at the interest rates that they are now in the high 6s or low 7s if you work with someone like Andrew Del Rey, Todd Avakian with Sarah Pacific Mortgage. 888-1172. They've been my sponsors for more than a decade now. They've done thousands of loans. They've done loans for young people and middle-aged people, and they've done reverse loans for old seniors, 62 and older, living in their primary home, people who want to get money out of their house as opposed to buy a house. They've done mortgages for people who have to move, and they're sitting on a wonderful 3.5% mortgage somewhere, and they have to move to another state so they can get a 6.5% or a 7% mortgage, and they counsel them through the whole thing. If you call 888-1172, 888-1172, Andrew Del Rey or Todd Avakian will walk you through the whole thing. If you're a veteran, doesn't require anything down. So if you really want to buy a house, go out there and become a veteran for 3 or 4 years, get a degree, get an associate degree, be smart, be part of the patriotic team, and then get a veteran's loan for nothing down. Or if you are a first-time home buyer, get an FHA. But either way, call Andrew and Todd, 888-1172. David Drucker is firmly in the middle of the Beltway. Drucker, are you in the Beltway? You got that white backdrop there. I don't know if you're
I know I am. I'm actually outside of my son's orthodontist office. So
okay, there you go. Guess what? You only have to go 500 more times. I had 3 teenagers. You live at the orthodontist office. Hey, David, I want to start with a specific and go to a general. Hampton Dellinger is the special counsel. He's been fired, and he wants his job back, and I think he's going to lose because he's part of the executive branch and the president can fire him. But this goes to a general question of how many people are being fired in the federal government. I looked at the real estate numbers inside the Beltway. The market is not loosening up with people who have to sell their homes. It's still a dramatic housing shortage. What is the particular about how many people are getting fired?
Yeah, I don't know, and I'm trying to find out. And one of the things I'm trying to find out is how many people that are getting fired are civil service, and how many people are not, and where are they trying to sort of do their best to stretch the limits of executive powers as it relates to civil service laws, which are a matter of statute. But trying to get a handle on everything Doge is doing or the White House is doing through this Department of Government Efficiency has been difficult, and the White House doesn't really like to give specifics. There is now a Doge website. I find it sort of hard to navigate, and it's not very easily understandable. But I'm not faulting anybody here, but I'm just trying to say I want to answer these questions. I haven't been able to yet.
I have read that 75,000 people took the early buyout. That's not even a dent in 2.3 million federal employees. And I don't know that they can afford to stop there if they're going to get a serious reduction in force underway. Do you?
Well, if you're looking at it from a pure number standpoint, no. But I mean, I think the larger question is how many of the 2.3 million employees aren't necessary? And the administration hasn't actually made a case or offered an explanation for how many are unnecessary and which departments and sub-departments and so on do these employees exist. Now, this isn't my way of saying, therefore, none of this is necessary and what they're doing is something wrong. What I'm saying is they're not talking about it. Nobody has said, listen, we've audited all of the employee, the employees, the positions filled and unfilled, let's say, at the Department of Energy, and we've concluded that X percentage of these positions are unnecessary or are overlapping. And here's what they are and why we think that. We've been, there's none of this information. These are the kinds of things I'm interested in reporting and actively working on, but it's not something that the White House is talking about in any way, shape, or form.
Do you think they have a good grasp on it themselves? Because I've looked myself. I don't go to the Doge website because I figure the website is going to be the last place you find something. But has any journalistic operation opened up, hey, if you've been laid off, just send us the details so that we can keep track?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I mean, the Washington Post has actually done a decent job of this. The New York Times has done some reporting. I've talked to some people employed by the government attempting to get a hold of this information. Things that I received weren't anything that wasn't anything that wasn't already out there, so I didn't really bother with it, although as an organization at the Dispatch, we did use some of this information. And these are the sorts of things we want to know. But it's interesting, Hugh. I actually think the mechanics of this are really interesting and newsworthy. And I don't think it would be necessarily a negative story for the administration, other than some readers might view the information negatively.
Yeah.
But they don't really want to talk about it.
I'm not a good plumb line. I'm interested in it because I ran OPM. So I'm just kind of interested in what kind of flex people can find in this. I'm following the Dellinger case very closely because I've been teaching Myers and Humphrey's executive for 27 years. Myers hold if you're in the executive branch, the president can fire you absent a civil service law to the contrary, and they certainly can fire the political people immediately. But Humphrey's executor holds if you're in an independent agency with a set term, you can't be fired except for cause. I think they might be trying to set up a constitutional challenge asking the court to revisit Humphrey's executor. What do you think, David?
Well, it would make sense to me. I mean, people have reported being fired for cause where there really is no cause, right? Where, obviously there are layers and layers of civil service employee protections and procedures if you're ever going to fire anybody. So there are constant employee reviews, and there are employees with stellar reviews being fired for not being good at their job. Now, maybe the reviews, weren't accurate, let's say, but nobody knows this. And I think what the administration is doing is in line with, in some ways, and we've talked about this, what a lot of presidents do, which is presidents are always willing to stretch the bounds of executive authority to get as much as they possibly can out of what they're able to do. So does the judicial branch, and Congress is the only one of the three that doesn't seem interested in this. So I think that they're doing this, and I think that if they can bring a case to court and win, and therefore have more power to do this, they're more than happy to do it.
They're going to win Dellinger, and that's going to prove what we've known since Myers. But I'm interested in burrowing, and burrowing is a practice that goes back to Reagan and Bush years, where
Sure.
a political appointee finds a way to burrow into the permanent government and stays there.
Right.
And I would love to find out how many people burrowed at the end of Biden. Do we have any indication of that?
We don't have any indication of that. Listen, people burrow at the end of every administration.
Yes.
As you just noted, there are ways to deal with some of these employees that you can't fire, right? I mean, one of the terms I was taught for a different story I wrote about the Department of Justice a couple of years ago for the Dispatch is rubber rooming, where you can't fire them, so you transfer them into a new position that basically, is about counting widgets all day. What are widgets? Well, they're nothing. So you sit in a room and do nothing, get so frustrated that you leave of your own accord. There are different ways of dealing with this. The interesting thing will be here is if the administration finds a way legally or other, I guess through the courts or otherwise, around civil service law that makes it impossible for you to fire people without an act of Congress. And I think that's really the tension here and what I'm watching for.
Or they could get the budget resolution to authorize a RIF. No questions asked, notwithstanding any other law, regulation, or guidance. David M. Drucker of the Dispatch. Always good to talk to you. Follow him on X at David M. Drucker. I am following as much as I can the Times of Israel coverage of the updates on the hostages. 6 hostages who are alive will be released by the terrorists this Saturday. 8 bodies of Israelis. There are rumors about which ones, but I do not traffic in those. Also set to be released over the course. There are 14 more people living and dead, 6 and 8, from best I can tell, that are supposed to come out on Thursday and on Saturday. Phase 2, the conditions are very hard, very, very high, that have been set by Benjamin Netanyahu. That includes that Hamas must leave. Not an optimist about Phase 2. I'm an optimist about one of our great sponsors, myphdweightloss.com, because Dwayne is the embodiment that it works. He lost 50 pounds. He kept it off. He lost it 2.5 years ago. It's wild. Did you start that 2.5 years ago?
Something like that, yeah.
864-644-1900 if you want to join up.
864-644-1900.
That's skinny Dwayne. Dwayne used to take up twice as much room on the shot there. So Generalissimo, 864-644-1900. Do you get any kind of a letter from them or a plaque? I'm trying to get to 100,000 YouTube subscribers to get a plaque. I'm wondering if you got a plaque from My PhD Weight Loss when you hit 50 pounds.
No, but they definitely kept in touch with me, and they helped me celebrate when I got there.
Oh.
I mean, they were my biggest cheerleader. They weren't like you.
No plaque?
No, I don't get a plaque.
I'm just saying, as a marketer.
What do you want? Like a protein teamwork thing?
Yeah, just a 50 pound, just a big 50-pound weight that you don't have to carry around anymore.
Like, how about a 50-pound wheel of cheese or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would make a lot of sense to me.
Sure.
We want people to do that. By the way, Dwayne's World dropping today?
Dwayne's World will drop in the morning. We tape it tonight.
Okay, so Dwayne's World is available at dwayne.world or wherever fine podcasts are available. And who's on this edition of Dwayne's World?
We'll talk to Challenge today.
Not Lilacs?
Lilacs is on Friday.
Oh, he's on with me today.
Oh, well, you'll like it. It was from last week.
You think he has 2 hits a week?
Does who have 2 hits?
Lilacs.
No, he has 1.
No, I mean, he talks to me once and he talks to you once, so that's why. Does he wake up the rest of the week?
Oh, yeah. He's doing his Substack that he's launched. He does 5 columns a week now. Oh, he's got all sorts of stuff on that Substack.
All right. Now, I'm talking to Chuck tomorrow, CJ Box.
Right.
And I am now up to the point where Abby Gate has entered the picture.
Yes, and that's really a great passage.
Yeah, I have now entered. I did not know that he was going to do that. That's the surprise of the book thus far. It's a great read.
Yes.
It is called, I can't remember what it's
Battle
called.
Mountain.
Battle Mountain. I've got Long Range over there, but I have Battle Mountain at home. Battle Mountain is a new CJ Box thriller, and I'll tell you all about it tomorrow.
Great
Don't
book.
go anywhere. Brett Baer kicks it off. Tom Cotton is coming along, talking about the book over my shoulder, over this shoulder. 7 Things You Can't Say About China, Part 3. Also have Andy McCarthy talking about who can you fire and when. Bret Baier is the host of Special Report. You can see him every night at 6 p.m. on Fox News Channel. Bret, this is a very difficult story to follow, what's going on between the Russian delegation, Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, and Special Envoy Witkoff. How are you going to approach this? Because we're not in the room where it's happening.
Yeah, good afternoon, Hugh. I think it is a little tough to divine exactly what's going on. It seems like these are the talks to set up the talks. I'll be doing my show tonight live from the Treasury Department with an interview with Treasury Secretary Bessent, who's obviously been a precursor to all this, going to Ukraine, taking that train trip in from Poland, meeting with President Zelensky, obviously is integral in all of this. So his comments tonight on all of this will add to the equation. But I do think it's tough to divine exactly where things are behind the scenes.
Now, that is very interesting because Noah Rothman was my guest first hour, and a pretty significant fellow on the right is upset that Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff began with the Russians and Zelensky canceled the trip to Saudi Arabia. But Secretary Rubio said this is shuttle diplomacy. We talked to the Russians, then we talked to the Ukrainians. I thought Bessent was really kind of the first move on this chessboard. Is that how you understood it?
It was. They made the go to Kyiv to meet with Zelensky. That was the whole push. Now, part of that was to get him to sign this rare earth minerals agreement, which he did not do. And I'm going to ask about that, too.
Now, the other thing about Bessent is that there's a lot going on at Treasury having to do with Doge. And I'm not quite sure what he thinks of Doge. Have you got a good sense of what he thinks of Doge coming over and messing around? He's defended it, but it seemed to me in a lukewarm sort of way.
Yeah, I've looked at all his comments before, and there'll be a whole line of questioning on that front tonight because, it is fascinating to see what Doge is doing and obviously can't do anything without the entrance of the Treasury Secretary and the President. By the way, Sean Hannity has the President and Elon Musk tonight on his show. So we've got a blockbuster interview.
Yeah, it's a big night. Now, I have been following, and I followed with David Drucker in the first hour. I'll talk with Andy McCarthy, who works alongside of you, sometimes on Fox as well, later in the program, about an obscure name, Hampton Dellinger. The Office of Special Counsel. It's got nothing to do with Jack Smith. It's an ethics official. He's in the executive branch. He's been fired by the president, and he's appealed that, and the administration has asked the Supreme Court to weigh in. Bret, do you discern a purposeful effort at every level to test the outside limit of the executive's authority to fire people?
Yeah, I think they're going to push it. They're going to push the limit. I do think that a lot of the executive power is already been laid out. It has been laid out. The Supreme Court is a pro-executive power-leaning Supreme Court in previous rulings. I do think that there will be challenges. Listen, on this Doge front, there are 70-plus lawsuits in 19 different states that deal with Doge and access to data, specifically Social Security numbers and private data.
I don't know if you watch CNBC ever in the morning, Bret. You have to work pretty late. Well, Alex Karp was on this morning, and he made a comment. I want to play it for you and get your reaction. It's cut number 18, and it's very provocative. Can you play that for me, Harley?
I don't want to go into the technical weeds here, but the problem in Germany is that somehow the small portion of Germans that believe you cannot talk about migration without being a bigot, which is about probably 15%, 90% of them vote for the Green parties, have somehow tricked the larger parties into saying they will only vote for things if the far right doesn't vote with them, which basically, as a matter of pragmatic power, shifts all immigration policy to a small group of people that literally will not let you discuss the fact that Afghani immigrants to Germany have a 70x propensity compared to German population to commit certain kind of crimes. And that in the last couple of weeks, every single terror attack has been the result.
Did you go to jail for pointing that out?
you'll get into trouble. But this is
So,
the weird thing.
Brett, this brings up what the reaction to the vice president's speech last week. Now, Alex Karp uses tech bro talk, 70X and stuff like that. But I think he's saying AFD ought to be in the conversation. I don't know anything about AFD. So this is a two-part question. Do you know anything about AFD and why they are verboten to talk about? And B, do you agree with Karp that they've boxed themselves into a corner in Europe about what they can and cannot discuss?
Well, B first, I think that 60 Minutes piece talking to German prosecutors about what they're going after people for was chilling and really stunning. And it goes right to the heart of what Vice President Vance was talking about in that speech about free speech. And it seems so counterintuitive to how it's being received. On Part A, I've only known what I've read about this party. So that's through a looking glass. I have not talked to them individually. I have not researched it extensively. But clearly it is a far right of the party that scares some portion of the German population to its, old roots. And I think whether fair or not, that's the painting that's put out there.
Yeah, they put that out about Meloni as well before she became prime minister of Italy, and she turns out to be a rather within
practical.
Yeah, she colors within the lines as far as I can tell, and I don't know anything about AFD or their leader. It's just that we're being asked to assume a lot of facts that are not yet in evidence. I'll talk to Andy about that. So here's the question, the big question. You've done defense reporting and you've been anchoring for a long time. Do you think the transatlantic alliance is shaky?
I actually do think it's a little shaky. I think it's at least wobbling, because not that we're going to walk away from the alliance. It's that they are scared and scrambling based on trying to guess what President Trump is going to do. I think that there is this communication. You saw that phone call with President Trump and Emmanuel Macron, and this emergency summit, this emergency meeting. Emergency meeting really wasn't about Russia and Ukraine. It was about Trump. And what is he going to do? And what is he going to say? And is he going to give away the store to the Russians? So I do think it's wobbly. I don't think we're walking away from any alliance.
I don't think it's going to crumble, but I do believe the president is very serious about the NATO defense budget, and he's also very serious about ending the war. And Rubio said that today. And I don't think they're used to America actually asserting itself. I don't know them when we last asserted ourselves in this fashion. Trump won, but that was stop and go and impacted by domestic politics. This time it's, the afterburners are on and they're coping. And I don't really know if there's a Fox News equivalent in Europe that I can turn to. There's Sky in Great Britain, but in Europe, is there?
Not really. No. In fact, the UK government is very, very careful to make sure they keep everything down the middle in their view, but it is leftish. So yeah, there isn't one. One quick analogy. I covered the Pentagon years ago after 2001, and covered obviously then Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld, and traveled around Europe with him. And that's when he was using the term old Europe and new Europe.
Yes.
And he was saying that NATO had paper armies. Those were early days, but he was challenging the status quo back then. President Bush didn't do it as much as President Trump does, but it was the early echoes of you better pay up.
And I think that paper army has gotten even more thinly cut, if not shredded, in the interim 25 years. Brett Baer, I'll be watching tonight because Bessent, I don't know anything about him, but he's a very interesting and obviously a very smart and accomplished individual. So big night on Fox News. We'll watch Scott Bessent with Brett Baer, and then Sean is going to talk to the president and Elon Musk. That's going to be wild. Where are they doing that, Brett? Do you know where the set is? Are they going to the White House?
He's already taped, so I think it was down in Florida. If I had to guess.
Okay. I will look forward to seeing it tonight. Thank you, Brett Baer. Don't go anywhere, America. I'll be right back. I'm going to talk with Andy McCarthy after I talked to Tom Cotton. Tom Cotton's brand new book, which is over my shoulder right there, 7 Things You Cannot Say About China. I taped a long interview with Tom Cotton yesterday, which we've broken up into many parts. It is, amid all the conversation about Russia and Europe, the biggest deal of all is what we're going to do about the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. By far, our biggest adversary / enemy is China, and Tom Cotton has written the primer that is available and accessible by everyone. Go over to Amazon and get it during the break, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. All week, I'm doing a series with Senator Tom Cotton on his brand new book, 7 Things You Cannot Say About China. In the very first segment, we talked about the last chapter, China could win. The second chapter of the book is China is preparing for war. And it begins by recounting, Senator, China's been fighting wars continually since Mao won, not just against Taiwan, but against Korea, the Soviet Union, India, Vietnam. I know about these things, but I don't really string them together like the string of pearls that you did. It's a pattern.
Yeah, I think, in the first chapter, we talked yesterday about China is an evil empire. That's what Ronald Reagan said about communist Russia. We need to say the same thing about communist China because it helps explain not just their oppression at home, but their incredibly aggressive record abroad. As you said, and as I write in chapter 2 of 7 Things You Can't Say About China, China has a long, bloody history since the rise of communism in 1949. There's almost no country on its border that it hasn't invaded. Some multiple occasions. It supported communist insurgencies all around the world, from Asia to Africa, even Latin America. So we shouldn't be surprised to see China becoming much more aggressive today against Taiwan, for instance, as China's gone from having a relatively small and backwards military to having the world's second largest military, or largest military and second most technologically capable military.
You mentioned an army of 4 million, a standing army of 4 million, and then on page 48, a single Chinese shipyard can produce more vessels than all of America's shipyards combined. China has 13 shipyards. That's sort of stunning, Senator.
Yeah, it's both a sad testament to what we've done in America to allow our shipbuilding capacity to atrophy, but also just how deeply invested China is in this military buildup to ultimately try to exclude America entirely from Asia, to prevent us from defending our own interests there. And that's most notable, again, in its shipbuilding capacity. One shipyard, or a single Chinese shipyard, is more than all of our shipyards combined, and they got 13 of them. That's why their Navy is now larger than our Navy, just like their Army is more than twice the size of our Army. As I say in the book, their overall military forces are twice the size of our military, more than twice the size, actually. Again, they're not quite as technologically capable, but they've closed the gap rapidly, and it's getting closer each year.
Now, you also write, today the People's Liberation Army has the world's 3rd largest and 2nd most advanced Air Force. Can they go toe-to-toe with our F-22s and F-35s or the Super Hornets?
Unfortunately, I think they probably could. In some cases, the radars they have on their fighters are as effective as our radars. And maybe most worrisome, the air-to-air missiles they have can outrange our air-to-air missiles. So Chinese pilots might see our pilots at the same time or even earlier, but they'd be able to strike them before we can. And that's to say nothing of the air defenses that they've built all along their coast to try to push America out of the so-called first island chain, and also of the sensing technologies they have from radar or from space through satellite systems. So I've seen a lot of war games about a potential conflict between China and the United States, and I can just say that none of them have a happy ending for America or for the world.
2 more facts from Chapter 2 in 7 Things You Can't Say About China. A single Chinese company manufactures 70% of the world's drones, and they have doubled the number of their intelligence satellites in space in the last 4 years. It is now only second to us. Will they pass us in space with satellite numbers soon, Senator?
Yeah, I think they probably will. And again, it's all designed to keep America away from China's near abroad, especially keep it away from Taiwan. If Communist China decides to go for the jugular in Taiwan, those satellites are designed specifically to identify American ships and American aircraft, and anything that we might have that could threaten China's control over Taiwan if they decide to go for the jugular on Taiwan. It's just another example of the breathtaking military buildup over the last quarter century. Since 2000, China's military spending has grown by more than 1,200%. Again, we've really seen nothing like it in the world, certainly not in the modern world.
There's more. I hate to say there's more. A square mile, for the benefit of the Steelers fans, a square mile, that's a mile on each side, is 640 acres. China has constructed 3,200 acres of new islands. That's a lot of military basing capability, Senator.
Yeah, and this is all available on open satellite imagery. You can see it over the years. This goes back to my early days in the Senate when Barack Obama basically took China at its word that it wouldn't militarize the islands it was building. Obviously, it broke that word. And what you used to have in the South China Sea were these small rocky outcroppings. Maybe at low tide, there'd be some rocks and scrubs available, but that was about it. And China, through dredging and building, has turned these into major naval and air bases. They have long runways for not just fighters, but heavy bombers, the most advanced radars. They have missile defenses and offensive strike missiles that could hit our Navy vessels going through the South China Sea. They have barracks. Some of them even have swimming pools for the soldiers that they plan to station there. That obviously pushes out the range of China's missiles and aircraft by several hundred miles from their mainland, but it also gives them the opportunity to perhaps control all traffic through the South China Sea, which is a critical seaway, not just for our Navy, but more than 1/3 of all global trade. And it all happened right under our watch.
Last statistic in this chapter, China is preparing for war. They went from almost no nuclear weapons to 500 today en route to 1,000. And the day is approaching, you write, where they will overmatch our arsenal.
Yeah, this is a big shift under Xi Jinping from China's traditional policy. They used to say they had so-called minimal deterrence, which is only enough nuclear weapons to prevent a nuclear adversary like the United States, like the old Soviet Union, from contemplating a first strike because they'd be able to strike back, to now building their own first strike capability by ground through missiles, by air from bombers, and by sea from submarines. When Xi took office a little over 10 years ago, they only had about 240 missiles. They've doubled that to 500. Our Pentagon thinks they'll double again by the end of this decade. By 2035, they'll be up to 1,500 warheads. That's an important number to note because almost how many we currently have under the so-called New START treaty with Russia, which is another example of how we've hamstrung our defenses against China. We have this nuclear arms control treaty with Russia going back to the Cold War era. We have several other arms control treaties. China has never been a part of any one of these treaties. They've never expressed any interest in being a part of them either. So we have tied our own hands behind our back as China approaches nuclear parity with us, and they may even pass us in the next decade. And if you combined their forces with their so-called all-weather friend, Russia, they actually have a nuclear overmatch against us right now.
Part 4 is coming up tomorrow, America. Do not miss it. Andy McCarthy is, of course, a Fox News contributor, Mr. Go-To on the criminal law, former lead prosecutor of the Blind Shake case, and a longtime prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. Andy, I want to go high constitutional law with you today. You put your con law justice robes on. Hampton Dellinger is the Office of Special Counsel. He is it, or he was. He's been fired, and he's suing. And Team Trump went right to SCOTUS and said, can we get it up to you? Now, I think he's covered under the Myers case, the 1926 9-0 case. You can fire anyone in the executive branch that is a political appointee, and not Humphrey's executor 9-0 case. You can't fire people on the FTC without cause. What do you think?
I agree with that. I also think the administration's spoiling for an opportunity to get Humphrey's executor in front of the court again for its reconsideration. They know that Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch have already signaled that they'd be very open to reconsidering Humphrey's executor. In seal of law, I actually hoped that they would reach the question, as those two justices indicated that thought they should have, just so people know what we're talking about. Humphrey's executor is kind of a New Deal era change in what was the settled law. You mentioned the Myers case from the 1920s. The Myers case actually talks about the first Congress back in 1788 or 1789.
89, yeah.
Yeah, where it was basically settled that the president has executive authority. And when you're talking about running the executive branch, exceptions to that rule ought to be narrowly construed. The one in the Constitution is that you require Senate confirmation to seat a certain level of government lawyer or government official. But there's nothing in the Constitution about the president having to get the Senate's or the Congress's consent to remove somebody. The president has to have plenary authority to fire people if the president is to run the executive branch. And all of the executive power in our government is reposed in one official, the president. So he has to be able to remove people.
But the FTC, which was up in Humphrey's executor, and if nothing else, I want a precedent that's easier to say than Humphrey's executor. That case is about removing a Federal Trade Commission commissioner in 1935. And in 9-0, the Hughes court says, nope, you can't do it. It's okay for Congress to set up independent agencies. I've always hated that, Andy, don't you? I mean, it's a mixture. It's a witch's brew of the congressional Article 1 and the executive Article 2 power. I don't like independent agencies.
Yeah, I think it's really the flashpoint, Hugh, of the difference between the originalist vision of the Constitution's framework and the vision of progressive governance, which is that separation of powers is a nuisance. It's okay to accumulate both legislative and police powers and even judicial powers in these supposedly independent agencies, which are, this would be anomalous to the framers. What we mean by independent in this context is they are independent of any branch of the government. Our theory of the Constitution, the framers' theory of the Constitution, was that power, particularly legislative power and executive power, had to be accountable to the people whose lives were affected. So that's the stakes here, and I think it's a very important fight in terms of how we're going to be governed going forward.
So they fired a National Labor Relations Board member. That engages Humphreys. They fired Dellinger. That engages Meyer. I think they want the court to answer this. Do you think the court will do so in the interest of, I'll just say, efficiency and clarity about how the government's supposed to operate?
I would like that, Hugh. If I had to bet, I would bet that this court will be, under John Roberts' steerage, more cautious than that. What they'll say is, look, we don't have to get into these hybrid type agencies that wield different species of constitutional power. What we can say in this case is that the special counsel's office is clearly a part of the executive branch, even if Congress tried to split it off as if it was independent in the 80s. He's clearly an executive officer. They describe themselves as basically the prosecutorial branch of the Merit Systems Protection Board. So
Right.
I think the court can say Trump has to be able to fire him without going to the next question, which is, what about these administrative agencies?
Andy, in the same year Meyer was decided, 1926, the Supreme Court opened the door to zoning in Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty. I hate that case. I hate zoning. I think it's an uncompensated taking. Do you think the court will ever nudge up against that, if only to push temporary takings or other impositions on people's ability to use their property?
I would have said no even a month ago. But I have to say, after the California fires, which you covered so extensively, they're raising questions that I would not have anticipated would come up, including the conditions that they want to put on people's liberty to rebuild, the coverage issues, and this whole idea of, we're going to rebuild, but we have to have different kinds of housing than existed before, so that we can remake what these communities look like. That's really a bridge further than I thought this would ever go. And sometimes a big crisis like that creates an opportunity for considering things you'd never thought you'd have to consider.
You made my day, because that's why it's forefront me. I did it for 27 years as a land use lawyer. When you were busy getting bad guys, I was trying to get houses built. And I just think what was originally a lot of deference given in the progressive era to the idea of expertise and zoning has just mushroomed, Andy, like everything else. Everything is mushroomed. And
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think that in, maybe from about, I want to say 1870 until the New Deal era, progressivism was more of a theory.
Correct.
The idea that we could have these altruistic bureaucrats who would just do good and public service. We now have a century of experience with it, and it's got all the downsides of a bad political system, but you're not able to reach the people who are making the decisions because there's no accountability. So as messy as democracy can be, and as much as progressives are repulsed by it in some of its iterations, it's a lot preferable, I think, to the progressive vision of governance.
Well said, and I'm going to play that in hour 3. Andrew C. McCarthy, follow him over on X at Andrew C. McCarthy. Read him at National Review, where he's the senior editor. See him on Fox, where he's a Fox contributor. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Hugh.
Joined by Byron York next hour. And I want to set it up by reminding you about all the things that the vice president said in Europe last week that got all the Europeans up in arms. And it's pretty hard to understand why, because the vice president was speaking on behalf of free speech. Now, ours is the country most blessed by the First Amendment. Other countries have quasi-First Amendment, but we have by far the most robust protection of speech in the world and in world history. Cut number 1, the vice president last week in Munich.
Europeans, the people, have a voice. European leaders have a choice. And my strong belief is that we do not need to be afraid of the future. You can embrace what your people tell you, even when it's surprising, even when you don't agree. And if you do so, you can face the future with certainty and with confidence, knowing that the nation stands behind each of you. And that, to me, is the great magic of democracy. It's not in these stone buildings or beautiful hotels. It's not even in the great institutions that we have built together as a shared society. To believe in democracy is to understand that each of our citizens has wisdom and has a voice. And if we refuse to listen to that voice, even our most successful fights will secure very little. As Pope John Paul II, in my view, one of the most extraordinary champions of democracy on this continent or any other, once said, "Do not be afraid." We shouldn't be afraid of.
I do not object when people like to say, oh, Trump isn't playing 4D chess or 3D chess. They want to always say Trump's just being Trump. I've heard a lot of people say J.D. Vance is playing 4D chess here and he's trying to upset the European. No, he's making a very vigorous defense of free speech and why the Europeans could embrace it and not be afraid of it. It's not 4D chess. It's pride in the American framing and in the American system. Cut number 2.
No voter on this continent went to the ballot box to open the floodgates to millions of unvetted immigrants. But you know what they did vote for? In England, they voted for Brexit, and agree or disagree, they voted for it. And more all over Europe, they're voting for political leaders who promise to put an end to out-of-control migration. Now, I happen to agree with a lot of these concerns, but you don't have to agree with me. I just think that people care about their homes, they care about their dreams, they care about their safety and their capacity to provide for themselves and their children. And they're smart. I think this is one of the most important things I've learned in my brief time in politics. Contrary to what you might hear a couple mountains over in Davos, the citizens of all of our nations don't generally think of themselves as educated animals or as interchangeable cogs of a global economy. And it's hardly surprising that they don't want to be shuffled about or relentlessly ignored by their leaders. And it is the business of democracy to adjudicate these big questions at the ballot box.
That left a mark. I think that's the one that left the mark. Also, cut number 5 leaves a mark.
But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
I'll talk more after the break about that. I do want to tell you about Conservatives for Lower Health Care Costs, which you can find out all about at pharmawindfall.com. Now, this is complicated. I wrote a column today for Fox News, Bravo, House GOP, because I put together the House budget, and the House budget will then go, if it passes the full House, and my column is an admonition to the Republicans to get behind the budget, it will then go to the various committees of jurisdiction to pass the various parts of that. One of those will be the committee having to do with health care. And the committee with health care will get bombarded by Big Pharma. And Big Pharma will want to, quote, delink pharmacy benefit managers like CVS is my pharmacy benefit manager from their ability to do business with you, the customer. Big Pharma will want more money. Pharmawindfall.com. Pharmawindfall.com. Go there and get smart about what you don't want to happen during the reconciliation process, which is for Pharma Windfall to get a hold of it. You want Big Pharma out of the room. Head over to pharmawindfall.com. I want to play one more, because Byron York is coming up next hour. I'm going to talk to him about the vice president's speech and the negotiations that have opened up with Russia and the earthquake going through Europe. But I want to play for you one more excerpt from the vice president's speech last week. It is cut number 6, please.
And unfortunately, when I look at Europe today, it's sometimes not so clear what happened to some of the Cold War's winners. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. Or to this very country, where police have carried out raids against citizens suspected of posting anti-feminist comments online as part of, quote, combating misogyny on the internet, a day of action. I look to Sweden, where 2 weeks ago the government convicted a Christian activist for participating in Koran burnings that resulted in his friend's murder. And as the judge in his case chillingly noted, Sweden's laws to supposedly protect free expression do not, in fact, grant, and I'm quoting, a free pass to do or say anything without risking offending the group that holds that belief. And perhaps most concerningly, I look to our very dear friends, the United Kingdom, where the backslide away from conscience rights has placed the basic liberties of religious Britons in particular in the crosshairs. A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Not obstructing anyone, not interacting with anyone, just silently praying on his own. And after British law enforcement spotted him and demanded to know what he was praying for, Adam replied simply, it was on behalf of the unborn son he and his former girlfriend had aborted years before. Now, the officers were not moved. Adam was found guilty of breaking the government's new buffer zones law, which criminalizes silent prayer and other actions that could influence a person's decision within 200 meters of an abortion facility. He was sentenced to pay thousands of pounds in legal costs to the prosecution. Now, I wish I could say that this was a fluke, a one-off crazy example of a badly written law being enacted against a single person. But no, this last October, just a few months ago, the Scottish government began distributing letters to citizens whose houses lay within so-called safe access zones, warning them that even private prayer within their own homes may amount to breaking the law. Naturally, the government urged readers to report any fellow citizen suspected guilty of thought crime. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
I think that everyone in that audience had better be aware that J.D. Vance speaks for much more than President Trump. He speaks for a rising cohort of American originalism aficionados who believe very much that we got it right in 1789, 1776, and Europe's Europe may have learned it after World War II, but they've forgotten. Joined by Byron York. He is the senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. You can follow him on X at Byron York. You also see him frequently on all the Fox channels. He's a Fox News contributor. Byron, thanks for setting aside a half an hour. I wanted to dive deep into the question of where the Atlantic Alliance is, and there are a number of fronts here. I'll get to the vice president's speech in the second segment. Let's start with Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, and Special Envoy Witkoff with the Ruskies in Riyadh today. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that they're beginning a real process. It tells me that they don't really want the European Union representatives around, and they don't actually want Ukraine at the table for the moment. I mean, obviously, Ukraine has to be included in this, but I think that's what it tells me. It tells me that something is actually going on, and there was something pretty fascinating actually in Politico Playbook this morning, which was that the European Union was really upset at not being included. But they pointed out that these European members had met in Paris the day before. And it said, after a 3.5-hour huddle, the response of the leaders to the biggest security calculus shift in decades was underwhelming. Leaders came up with no new joint ideas. They squabbled over sending troops to Ukraine and once again mouthed platitudes on aiding Ukraine and boosting defense spending. So they're not going to get anything done. So I think this tells you that Donald Trump is trying another way to get something done.
Now, I'm going to play for you Secretary Rubio in a moment, but I want to remind everyone and get your comment. Brett Baer and I were talking about this last hour, and Brett is interviewing Scott Bessent tonight, the Secretary of the Treasury. All of this began with Bessent getting on a train in Poland and going to see Zelensky. And so the vice president's speech is in the middle. All the diplomacy is in the middle, and now part 3 is happening in Riyadh. But it began with Bessent going to Zelensky. So it's sort of shuttle diplomacy on 3 continents that it's not as easy to follow as Kissinger going back and forth between Egypt and Tel Aviv in 1973, but it's all coordinated.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, Trump has thought about how to do this in some new way that might actually yield progress. I mean, you just can't do what Joe Biden did and say, well, we're behind Ukraine for as long as it takes. We'll maybe slow walk some of the weapons, but we're behind Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that's what he said. I mean, it was kind of a policy by platitude, and that's not going to work. So this is slightly reminiscent of the whole Abraham Accords thing in the first Trump administration, which is they see this intractable problem and they want to approach it in a way that might actually work.
Now, do you this gets to the nub of American media coverage. I'm not sure American media wants Trump to, quote, win here, which would be in a ceasefire acceptable to both Zelensky and Putin. That would be an enormous win. I'm not sure the American media and the Democratic Party is on board with that.
No, probably not, because, look, they are so deeply invested in saying that Trump is in thrall to Vladimir Putin, that he's Vladimir Putin's lapdog, or he's whatever he is with Vladimir Putin, or he's indebted to him, or Putin has all sorts of blackmail information on him, or something. I mean, we've heard it for 8+ years right now. I was just going back for a column today over some of the Russia stuff from early 2017. They're deeply invested in this. So if Trump were actually to come up with a solution that did work for Zelensky as well as the Russians, I kind of agree with you. They would have a hard time acknowledging that.
Now, in Euro Intelligence this morning, which I have excerpted in news items from John Ellis every morning, one of the European analysts said, the hard truth is Ukraine has lost. By that, they don't mean that the lines have broken down, but that the correlation of forces is deeply injurious to Ukraine and its ability to survive as a nation. They can't keep losing people like this. Is that your understanding, Byron?
Well, they've lost just an unbelievable amount of human life. There's just no doubt about that. and you just can't keep doing that. Russia is clearly a larger and stronger force, and the Russians have never shown that they cared at all about human life, about losing, just however many people it took to throw at a situation. It did devolve into kind of a World War I style standoff where they're lobbing artillery shells at each other all day, just using up vast amounts of ammunition and just destroying the whole place. And it seems to me that the premise of the whole Trump effort is Ukraine will have to give up some sort of territory. They're just going to have to. And the idea of saying a settlement must include Ukraine going back to its pre-2014 borders before the Russians took Crimea, plus before they took all the stuff in the east that they've taken this time around. I just don't think that works. That's not tenable. I don't think it's the basis for the United States effort.
Marco Rubio said this in a press conference after the first round. It was a 4.5-hour sit-down between Rubio, Walz, and Witkoff, Lavrov, and Putin's buddy, whose name is escaping me, cut number 11.
The Ukrainians and the Europeans have suggested they feel very sidelined about how the process has played out so far. How do you intend to address their concerns? And will they be incorporated in future meetings in a multilateral way?
Well, the comment I would have on that is that for 3.5 years while this conflict has raged, or 3 years while it's raged, no one else has been able to bring something together like what we saw today, because Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that can. So no one is being sidelined here. But President Trump is in a position that he campaigned on to initiate a process that could bring about an end to this conflict. And from that could emerge some very positive things for the United States, for Europe, for Ukraine, for the world. But first it begins by the end of this conflict. And so the only thing President Trump's trying to do is bring about peace. It's what he campaigned on. It's something the world should be thanking President Trump for doing. He's been able to achieve what for 2.5, 3 years no one else has been able to achieve, which is to begin this process, a serious process. Obviously, a lot of work remains before we have a result. But President Trump's the only one that can do it.
I don't think he's going to give away the store, by the way, Byron York. Do you?
Yeah. Yeah, remember that the reason Trump says this war in Ukraine would never have happened if I had been president, when he says that October 7th would never have happened if he had been president, the reason he says that is because there really was a Trump unpredictability factor, and people and foreign actors just had to wonder how Trump would react to something as the leader of the strongest nation in the world, what he would do. And they were afraid of pushing it too far. So, I mean, that's the factor behind whatever Trump is doing. And I think that's what's going on in Russia and what's going on in Ukraine right now, which is they're trying to think, what will Donald Trump do if we don't agree to what he's proposing?
Now, President Zelensky canceled a trip that was previously scheduled to Riyadh. He was in Turkey meeting with Erdogan, and then he said, I'm not going. And he's mad, or he's showing off for domestic politics. I don't know. And to a certain extent, it is not of consequence to the overall issue about whether or not they're consulting with him. What do you think he's trying to message with that? And it may have been very ill-advised to do that. I'm not sure I would have done that if I was advised, but I'm not. What did you make of it, Byron?
Well, I thought it was for domestic consumption. I mean, because I agree with what you said earlier, characterizing this as kind of an updated form of shuttle diplomacy. Since I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be shut out, this struck me as something for domestic consumption, but doesn't help.
Yeah, it does not help. Now, there's one more Rubio cut number 12.
Well, I would start by saying we've agreed on 4 principles that I think are important. The first is that we're going to appoint our teams respectively to work very quickly to reestablish
Do you have any reporting, Byron, on who the team is from the United States? I thought the team was Rubio, Witkoff, and National Security Advisor Walz.
No, I don't know who that's going to be.
And any idea on timeline for this thing?
No, but I mean, clearly they want to move quickly. So, I mean, Rubio's been pretty darn active and impressed a lot of people, including me, just in the last 28 days. So I think it'll move pretty fast.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with that trio. I didn't hear Mr. Witkoff say anything, but I played all the other clips. Byron is a predicate to coming back, talking about J.D. Vance's speech in Europe last week. I had Noah Rothman on earlier talking about the Alliance for Deutschland, AfD. This is the often described as far-right fascist party in Germany. I personally don't have any knowledge of why that is. I do know that Prime Minister Meloni was allegedly a fascist, and she turned out to be a kind of normal conservative in Italy. What do you know about AfD?
Not enough, but enough to agree with you on that. I have been the things that I've read and watched about the degree of suppression that has taken place in Germany, suppression of AfD. AfD is almost a word of mouth phenomenon. That you can't see them in any media coverage. A citizen cannot see them in any media coverage. They can't be discussed, and yet their message is getting out. Now, we've had a lot of occasions with parties on the right in Europe polling really well, and then election day comes and they don't do as well as maybe they thought they were going to do. So that could happen this time. But what's striking is that it's being done. Whatever progress AfD is making, they are making in the face of incredible suppression. And AfD was one of the subtexts of J.D. Vance's speech, basically the part about suppression of free speech.
So what you just said is what I said, what Noah Rothman said. It's not what Margaret Brennan said. I don't want to dunk on Margaret anymore. She's been dunked on enough. Let's go to the sub. I don't think Americans know anything about German politics, and that they ought not to be talking about German politics. And I don't think 60 Minutes ought to be holding up those three people as admirable. Do you think we're just out of our league here?
I was stunned by that. I mean, I really was stunned. I mean, you had the J.D. Vance speech, and then you had, on a single day, you had the Margaret Brennan thing, which came in an interview with Marco Rubio, and then you had the 60 Minutes thing, in which they seemed to kind of celebrate these actions that certainly in the United States would be grossly unconstitutional. And you're right, we don't know enough about it. Obviously, Germany has an experience in the last 100 years that thankfully we don't have, and almost all other countries don't have either. But it affects them to this day. It shapes almost everything they do. So those are big important things to remember. But no, I don't know enough about it to talk
I just think it's useful for Americans to be humble about what we know American politics pretty well. You know it better than most. And I just hesitate to, after I was fed the line about Meloni, I'm just very suspicious of American reporters telling me the fascists are back, because she's like the least fascist I've ever seen.
But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America.
That, my friends, is what sent Europe backwards and reeling. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I am joined by Byron York. Byron, the ripple effects of the vice president's speech continue to this day. Europe is still kind of trying to figure out what was he wasn't playing four-dimensional chess. I think he was just laying it out. What do you in those 38 seconds? He said, we're going to settle Russia, Ukraine. You got to pick up the tab for NATO, and you got to get back to first principles of freedom. That's a lot in 38 seconds, and they weren't ready for it.
But that's exactly what he meant. You're absolutely right about the chess part. He's not doing that. He's just saying this. This is a message, that Donald Trump really wouldn't deliver himself. Trump, was very strong in his message to NATO that they have to pay more for their self-defense. But some of the cultural aspect that Vance touched on, I think he seems particularly well suited to do that. And a lot of the speech. Now, you probably played a couple of sound bites where he talked about the persecution and prosecution of people who pray silently at some distance from abortion clinics. And that's important. But I think the biggest aspect of this speech was about migration. And he said, there's no issue bigger than mass migration right now. And there are countries in Europe that are experiencing higher crime rates than they should, that are suppressing free speech over the issue of migration, and that are kind of coming apart over the issue of migration. He pointed to Brexit, didn't spend a lot of time on it, but it's pretty clear that a lot of people voted for Brexit over the issue of migration. They didn't get what they wanted, but they voted for it for that reason. And so Vance was sending this message to them, and they are shaken, but I think they're very hostile to the issue of migration. And they've been hostile. Somebody posted today a photo. Trump went over at one point, 2017, 2018, and he was telling the Germans, do not build this pipeline. Do not become dependent on Russia for your energy, for its natural gas. Do not become dependent on Russia. They're not good guys, and you don't want to be so dependent on them. And they were just laughing at Trump, just laughing at him.
Yeah.
And
Angela Merkel was not Thatcher. And a lot of people were fooled by that. She made a terrible decision to denuclearize, and she made a worse decision to open the gates to unrestricted migration. What American media did not reference much, that the vice president did mention, is that right before he gave the speech, I think the night before, there had been a car terrorist attack. An Afghan migrant had run. It's just like New Orleans on New Year's early morning day, like 12:30 a.m. on New Year's Day, and that this is a common enough occurrence that we don't even report on it now, Byron.
Yeah, and you're right that Vance gave the speech in the context of that attack, which everybody, of course, knew who was listening to it. But so much of the speech, which appeared to be about freedom of speech, free speech, and it was, but a lot of that was directed at speech about the immigration issue, which is suppressed and sometimes punished in European countries that should have a greater respect for freedom of speech.
So if you were to guess, what we know the next step will be shuttle diplomacy and some meetings on the war. What happens vis-a-vis NATO? Because Trump told him 8 years ago, get up to 2.5%. They're not even close. What's the next step for Trump?
Well, some of them have increased the amount. So Trump can point to that, the amount that they spend on their own defense. Trump can point to that and say, great, do more. And the idea that if after seeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you as a European country didn't really, really, really increase your defense budget, it's just kind of hard to believe. And yet they didn't, because they think always their big, strong friend will take care of them, will protect them. And Trump keeps saying, and he's delivered a very consistent message for 8 years now, you've got to pay. You've got to pay. And by the way, there's a new Secretary General of NATO, but the one who just left, I think his name was Stoltenberg.
Yes.
He said when Trump was out of office, so Trump didn't have any power over him at that point, he said, what Trump did made NATO stronger. We spent more on our own defense, and we became stronger.
Now, the domestic political equipment, I want to talk to you about Israel in the last segment that we do off air, and I'll play it when we come back. But the domestic side of this is the Biden presidency was such a disaster for the world. It was weak at every level, that those who covered up for his incapacity and the incompetence of his subordinates are in a corner now, Byron. I don't know that we'll get a fair readout of what's going on from legacy media for a decade. Do you?
Yeah. Well, basically what you're saying is when a reporter tells you that something is true, you look at them and say, yeah, but you told me that Biden was sharp as a tack, too.
Yes.
And so I didn't, you were lying to me then, and I don't believe you now. That's the big problem.
And so when they report on DOJ or Elon Musk.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons the president is flooding the zone with on-the-record remarks is so that they can't make stuff up.
Yeah. Listen, I am still in favor of much greater transparency on the part of the White House and DOJ, and by that I mean more systematic transparency, like explaining to us what they're doing instead of giving us 2 or 3 examples of this insane grant or that crazy program, but giving us a more systematic description of what's going on. I feel like I could never write a news story based on some of the sound bites that we've heard about it. You would need more systematic information. So that's important. But you're right. Trump has flooded the zone with action in a way that has really left Democrats and their allies in the press flummoxed.
I think Andy McCarthy told me that there are 70 lawsuits. I don't know how that is even tracked. I know the one that's before the court right now on whether or not the Office of Special Counsel can be dismissed. The answer is yes, and we're going to get that pretty quickly. But I don't know about the NLRB executive. 70 lawsuits. It would be useful if somebody would just give us the dockets, not tell us what they think is happening, but just let us read the orders. Byron, there have been big stories before elections, terrorist attacks, the 2008 financial crisis, but they've been discreet, and we've been able to get lots of different perspectives on a discrete set. This is a lot of stories happening at once, and I'm jumping from continents to Israel right now, and from a different war to a different war, and from phase 1 to phase 2. The only guy that connects all this is Witkoff, as he's like everywhere. I just never heard of him until last month. Have you?
I absolutely agree with you. I'm totally fascinated by this because obviously for the first Israeli ceasefire, they're all thanking Witkoff. And I say, okay, well, that's interesting. This guy's done a very impressive job here. And then you're right. You just start seeing Witkoff everywhere. Wherever there's a problem and it's kind of intractable, there's Witkoff.
So Harry Hopkins. And so Harry Hopkins is wandering around, and Harry Hopkins, I don't even know if he drew a salary. He lived at the White House. Do you have any hope at all? I do not. I'll put my cards on the table. I don't think there's going to be a phase 2. I think Israel's going to resume the war. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, in terms of the releases of bodies and living hostages, is that going to be it? Everybody? Every single person accounted for?
No. There are 73 right now, and a total of 14 will be accounted for dead or alive by Saturday night. So we'll be down to 60 unaccounted for dead or alive. So
it seems to me that Netanyahu has been very, you talk about not playing 4D chess here, has been very clear about what he wants to accomplish. And it's this 3-point thing. You might be able to recite it, and I can't, but it's basically to destroy Hamas and to destroy its ability to govern and organize and, be a political force or any sort of force.
And the Palestinian Authority is in the same box. They can't come back to Gaza either.
So, that's the goal. And and he really hasn't changed that goal. And I think he's going to continue pursuing that goal. And so the question is, in terms of hostage releases, this is always such a kind of a heartbreaking calculus that public officials or government officials have to go through, because you understand Hamas is obviously up to no good, and you've got to make a decision when to go back to war with them. And if you do have families of hostages who desperately want their loved one to survive and be freed sometime. And it's just the worst sort of unsolvable problem. But my guess is you're going to have more war.
That's what I think as well. And we'll leave it there. Byron, thank you for an extra dollop of time. So many different moving parts in a news environment unlike any that I've covered in 25 years. I appreciate your time. Byron York. Follow him on X at Byron York. Read him at the Washington Examiner. And, of course, see him on Fox News. Now I have to play for you the dumb media quote of the day. This is Mara Gay of the New York Times on Morning Joe this morning, cut 21.
That's right. It's very clear that the nation's largest city right now is leaderless. Essentially, Eric Adams really should resign. And if he cares about putting New York first, as he says he does, the most heroic thing he can do in this moment is step down. There is a mechanism, as you said, for the governor of the state, under the city charter, actually, to remove the mayor. That's an extreme action. There is a second option as well, which is called an inability committee of city officials there's kind of a higher bar to do that, but that could also remove him. I think that's a little less likely. I still think it's unlikely that the governor will remove the mayor unless she absolutely has to. There's a lot of reasons why that may not be, an ideal move. I think especially at a moment where you have a sitting elected mayor, in the drama of the crisis of democracy that's playing out, there's no easy option here because Mayor Adams is duly elected. He is up for re-election this year. There will be an opportunity for New Yorkers to replace the mayor.
All right, so we're having an
June
election in
primary.
New York, and we're in a crisis of democracy. I really do think American media has lost its mind. Lilacs is in the house, as in James Lilacs, humorist extraordinaire. You can see him lift your cup to you. You can read him at Lilac Substack. You can also, of course, listen to the Diners podcast. James, I was making a list. How long have you been journalisming? How long have you been doing this business for?
I started my first column at the Minnesota Daily in 1978. I started writing regularly for them about 1980. So it's been about 45 years regularly that I've been doing this kind of stuff.
Okay,
I
and
wouldn't necessarily call.
I started in
necessarily call-
1990, so I wanted to get that's 75 years total, right?
Oh man, are we old?
We're not.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so in those 75 years that we have combined experience in journalism and whatever it is, has it ever been this broken?
I don't think so. There was a period when it was broken, but the people in charge of it didn't know that yet. And that was an interesting period. I think that was the 90s and the aughts. But then along came the rise of the blogosphere. Along came the first great challenges to what had been a monopoly for so long. And then they began to realize that something was amiss. But what we have nowadays is, people who are deeply convinced that it is their ideological mission to do certain things. Now, there's always been sort of a cohort of people who believed, coming out of the post-Watergate era, that they're there to set things right. They're there to hold power accountable, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, as that tiresome line always goes. But that was, back in the days when there was this sort of general idea formed in the great blob of NPR and the Washington Post and the New York Times and the rest of it, still was a little bit more to the center than it is today. Now they've completely mistaken their own activism and hair on fire stuff for journalism as such. That's a very broad and crude way of putting it, but no, I think it's more broken now than it's ever been.
So I came around to ask you this question because first hour I asked Noah Rothman, do you know anything about AfD, this party in Germany that's got the Euro's hair on fire? And he didn't. Then I asked a couple more guests, and they didn't. And if Byron York doesn't know anything about it, then nobody knows anything about it. I don't know. I looked up a BBC article, but I said, I'm not going to believe the BBC on the AfD. Do you know anything about the AfD?
I know that it is a center-right organization in Germany, a political party, and hence center-right. It's got to be Nazis, right?
Nazi.
They have been in trouble recently for using a slogan which I believe is "everything for Germany" or "Germany for everything" or something like that. It's probably one long Teutonic word, Deutschland eigen. That sounds very scary when you say it. They are opposed to immigration. They believe probably that the whole project that Merkel et al. Went in to have lots of people come in, not assimilate, has been bad. They probably, I think, believe that the energy policy of denuclearization and carbon and net zero is bad. But they're not Nazis. As far as I can tell, they're not Nazis. And I think the gold standard for Nazis in Germany is pretty clear. They would be the Nazis. So... Nazis.
Yesterday, I very rarely laugh out loud to podcasts, but I was listening to National Review, and Charles C.W. Cook reacted quite strongly to the German crying over or calling J.D. Vance's speech inappropriate. He said, just make cars and shut up. And he said, the Germans are doing it again. And I really do sense there is a latent anti-German reflex in the American memory. Do you think that's true?
Well, yes. I mean, because we all grew up in the movies of the bad guys, and they were the bad guys. They were the absolute bad guys. But that's also been tempered over recent years, where they seem to have mellowed and softened into this sort of passive blob of formerly rigorous people who shrug their shoulders and can't really do anything and go along with whatever the authority says. Now, I've been looking at this because the ability in Europe to say things outside of the received wisdom, outside of the guardrails, varies from country to country. But you get the idea that anything out of a center-left leftist opinion is going to be regarded as horrors because they all know where that leads, right? Nationalism inevitably leads to Hitler. Nationalism led to World War One. Any sort of pride in one's own culture, you can't really do that because look what that got us in 1914. So they have this reflexive, distaste for that sort of stuff. But as I said on the own podcast with Charles C.W. Cook a while ago, look, at this point we're looking at them and saying, get over it. World War One.
I'm surprised J.D. Vance wasn't arrested, given the reaction that we've seen. You do a podcast with Charles C.W. Cook?
Certainly do. I do from time to time on a weekly basis. I'm surprised too, because if you look at what 60 Minutes did that story on how Germany is knocking on doors and busting down people for posting memes, racist memes. I haven't seen the memes, so I can't see if they are or not. But the article accompanied them saying that they were bringing a bit of German order to free speech. Now, the phrase German order does not necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. To them, it must mean a certain Teutonic rigorousness, the same sort of engineering skill that makes them make great cars and the like. To some of us, the idea of German order imposing itself on speech brings something very different. We hear the squeak of Hugo Boss designed leather coats is what we hear.
Did you ever see the movie Barry Lyndon?
Yes, long time ago.
You remember Barry Lyndon ends up in a Prussian regiment. I happen to have seen this fairly recently when my wife was out of town, and someone told me I had to watch it because of the Kubrick
I
film.
love this. My wife is out of town. Finally, I get the chance to watch the Kubrick film shot only with natural light. You're a different
for
kind of
3.5 hours. No one told me how long. But
Yeah.
the Prussian, no one wants to be in the Prussian army. That's the takeaway from that movie. I'm at sea covering Europe. I don't know what they're having a conniption about. Do you?
No, I do very much so, because they're dealing with a population that is becoming increasingly restive. And not only Germany, you take a look at England, take a look at Ireland. When you have people who are saying we want to be welcoming, we want to give people who need asylum, but you're dumping 30,000 people in our small little village of 5. And when you have stories splashed over the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, a much more moderate paper, saying this person gets sent to jail for burning the Quran, this guy who stabs him actually gets an increase in his food stipend. That sort of two-tier policing is what is increasingly making people nervous, and you can repeat it in every single country. Italy a lot more. France, can't say. But yeah, I think there is a thread that runs through all of these, and it's a feeling of being tired of being under the yoke of the people who know better than you, and don't you go being proud of your nation.
The big 3 minutes. Lilacs is with me. Lilacs, when we were children, we learned that after Pearl Harbor, George Marshall and I think Field Marshal Dill got together with FDR and Churchill, and they decided, Europe first. We're going to go take care of Germany first. We'll play a little bit of defense and offense in the Pacific, but we're going to beat Germany first. And I think we've been stuck on that for 85 years. Now I've got this book that Cotton put out, Senator Cotton, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. Russia is really not our number one problem right now. China is. Do you think we're kind of going through the pangs that accompany a reorientation towards the number one threat?
I hope so. I mean, the strategy in World War II was what they would later call win, hold, win, right? That we'd have a 2-front war. We would deal with these guys later, but first we take care of this one. And that sort of thinking, I think, probably has characterized the defense thinking for an awful long time. And you can understand why. In the 80s and the 90s, we were dealing with, sure, a diminished USSR and then no USSR, but they still had the nukes. They still had lots of stuff. We've seen them burn through lots of stuff in the last 2 or 3 years or so, and their capabilities are diminished. And Europe seems to be waking up to the fact that, this might be a problem. So while we should always keep our eye on that and make sure that we stand stalwart in defense of Baltic states, which deserve to be free. Let's get our Navy up to shape so that it's not rusting off, looking bad in the TikToks when it hits something. Finding out exactly what our capabilities are for shipbuilding has been a discussion for the last couple of days, as far as I understand, and an important one. And at the same time, when you have Trump talking about how we need to onshore our semiconductor industry, people worry about that and say, does that mean he's giving up on Taiwan? It's like, well, no, we're hedging our bets in case whatever situation comes up. China has been aggressive with its borders, with its territories, with building little atolls and extending their sovereignty around that. It's obvious that they want control of that lake, and we should continue to make sure that the seas are free. So, yeah.
So it's obvious, but I'm not sure it's obvious to NATO. And I think they're shaken. I don't think the alliance is shaky, but they are shaken by the fact that we might not care a whole lot for what they think about where our priorities ought to be. I want to give you the last word. Is that correct?
I don't know. I can't speak. I do know that if they are indeed shaken about it, then they best do something about it. And that's a matter of picking up their tab. That's a matter of reinforcing, doing what Poland is doing, from what I understand, which is much more robust defense. Finland, of course, being that close to Russia concentrates the mind. The USSR may be gone, Putin may be gone after a little while, but the traditional Russian way of looking at territories to the east or to the west is still there. So yeah, if their minds have been concentrated by the prospect of hanging, however long it may be down the road, good. Because then they'll do something. And if it relieves a little of us, that's fine. I still want us to be, the shining example of what Europe can be economically, in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of freedom of freedom of discourse, all of these things. But, after
we can hope.
We can hope. Stand on their own 2 feet, then good.
Lilacs, thank you. Follow them on X at Lilacs. Go to lilacs.com. And, of course, listen to the Dino